want to do is to have a little moment together to give the audience a chance to dream. So what would the city or the community or the place of your dreams look like roughly in a generation's time? So maybe, you could say technologically we're in a decade mode roughly where we have obsolescence. And in terms of the built environment, it's closer to 30 years. So let's just say roughly in 2050, if you had carte blanche, what would it look like? So you've already shown some things, but maybe you can depict it. And in particular, let's try and do something a little bit counterintuitive, which is to make that depiction accessible to the many. Is this a place that you can imagine a person today who has let's say, a light college education be able to afford? It may not be a place for every refugee, but maybe over another generation or two, it could be reaching that. So the notion of dreaming with affordability in mind, and of course, ecological intelligence. Maybe, Dror, you want to go first? I'll go last this time.
Sure. So, we are in the process of thinking long-term with those projects. And one of the things that for me is very important is how does cities of the future can maintain the culture of the places that they're built in. This is one of the most interesting things for me right now because I travel all over the world and I see identical developments happening in Chicago and in Marrakesh and in Riyadh, right? And I'm just tired of seeing this identical mid-rise and high-rise glass, steel, and concrete building that have no identity. So, of course, when we're talking about we want to have cities with nature, it's clear to us what it looks like, right? It's clear to us that we will have local flora and fauna integrated into the cities. But I would love to incorporate local artists and artisans into the process of large-scale development and small-scale development, which are simply not happening in most parts of the world today because we just don't know how to integrate them. There's issues with liabilities, so we're hiring the big firms that sits in glass offices in, London or New York or Shanghai to work on projects across the ocean. So I would really love to see a lot more integrations of local talent, bringing back the ability of craftsmanship. And I'm not just talking about going back, I'm talking about the use of technology in ways that we can bring identity to places. That's one of the things that I'm dreaming about because, that's what I see as co-creation, right? Like we're bringing all of the best talent of a specific place to participate in the future creation of that specific place.
Well, again, I really share your view here, and an image that people may have in mind for this is Wakanda. Can you imagine something like Wakanda in India? Maybe it's not a superhero town, but definitely this notion of vernacular. Probably most people know this concept. Vernacular architecture is when you focus on some of the heritage that's from the place, and it could be something related to nature, something related to belief systems, whichever it is. So this basically I would summarize what you're saying. Forgive me for doing that, but to say how do we bring in vernacularism into a high-tech harmony with nature for the many? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Alexander, what's your dream?
Well, I'm sorry. Well, I would say that in 2050, 2060, right? We'll all be living in mega cities or in mega urban regions that don't always have the density of Manhattan, but they're built up, and there's certainly to your point about intentional communities, there might be smaller intentional communities in there, but largely it is an unintentional community of people having to live together with people they don't necessarily share many values with. But so we're together in big mega cities. Large or substantial portions of the planet will be set apart as national parks, as portions of the planet we can no longer touch, just for ecosystem restoration, so we have to keep our hands off of it. So the planet will almost be defined through the zones where humans are now no longer wished, which is something we have decided together. Think about it, there are some people working on this, that you take all the national parks in the world and you connect them in a big global national park structure. So that's not the mega city, but that's what we save. When it comes to the third big space hog, so we have the mega cities, the giant national park, agriculture. Agriculture is number 3. My prediction is that agriculture will be completely internalized. So I know there's a lot of discussion in Flanders today about agriculture. I'll tell you what is the future of agriculture. Enclosed boxes, not out in the field. You make a big warehouse, you do farming indoors, you have 4-5 crop cycles per year, you don't lose 1 gram of fertilizer, you don't lose 1 drip of water. It is extremely efficient, it has huge yields, the environmental externality, stick stuff, gone. How nice would that be? So agriculture needs to be basically put in giant high-tech boxes, and that way we can provide sustenance to the 8, 9, 10 billion people that we will be, to the scale that we need it for. So I should sit down again because I get a bit too enthusiastic. But mega cities, Thomas, large national parks that we stay away from, and agriculture in big boxes.
Well, thank you. I'm not going to contradict either of you because I have, let's say, there's overlaps in my view. In particular regarding mass customization. So I helped found a movement with MIT actually, called the Fab City Initiative, trying to make makers also placemakers. So if you're familiar with the maker space where you can play with 3D printers, laser cutters, etc. That's typically called a Fab Lab that originated as a network from MIT with a guy called Neil Gershenfeld. And so I was part of developing that network. I started the first lab like that in the UK, and we got involved in trying to see how does making actually spill into the city making. And I think that's something I really believe in, and I believe in that from 2 parts. One is the notion of personalization, customization, make it your own. Don't just wait for the city to happen, or create layers, a bit like on your phone. You can customize your phone look. Maybe we'll be able to do similar things about our homes, but also the city as a collective. And I think that's important to create identity. So that's one aspect where I really share a lot of values. Regarding the way we deal with ecology, I think that my view is that it's quite possible that we will earmark areas more and more for restoration of land, and we will also terraform some areas for the protection of megacities, actually, like Alexander showed, or what they've built around Venice, which is a large dike. And you have this all over this, in the north of Europe, and in particular in Holland and Flanders and Belgium. So many big projects like these that will help us manage our relationship to land. But where I slightly would, let's say, caution us is that I think we need 2 other big areas of thinking, and they are already growing. One that was presented earlier today probably. Have any of you seen the presentation by Christian Jochnik about juntos? Have you seen your presentation about juntos? Not many people here. You should have seen it. And if you can see it, you can see it another day. In any case, the idea is that regenerative farming, which is let's say, potentially more complicated to do at scale than even organic farming, may have found a hack so that it can become an economic player and also scale the regeneration and restoration of land. There's a model in Ibiza, there will be more, but effectively it's about creating shared infrastructure for farmers so that they can be trained, they can have access to machines, they can productize, they can brand, they could put into the market their farming products in new ways that they couldn't before. Why am I saying this? Because I think that cities and farms will come together more and will have to play in this dynamic. And I agree that we will need for megacities, in particular in China and India, ways to box farming. But I think we also need to think about land use, and not necessarily the pastoral life, but to be in connection with nature is important. For one, I would say it's also important that we have food. And I was one of the co-founders with Kimball Musk of a company called Square Roots Grow, which actually takes containers and puts farming inside the containers and trains new generations of farmers. So I'm not against it. I'm just saying I think we need a balance between these things. And the last comment I'll make, just to draw a picture of my dream, is that it's probably very close to supernature, which is why I joined the project, which is that building cities right now or communities is in conflict with nature. Every time you move something, you have embedded CO2, you release it in the atmosphere, and basically you're just trying to self-correct and make it less and less bad over time. I think in the future, even if there will be embedded CO2 issues, and we have to think about that, overall, building will become the matrix for life to be part of it. So we will be actually the stewards of the planet by building cities instead of being the destroyers of the planet by making cities. And this, interestingly enough, could happen in some of the low-density, peri-urban areas, or be experimented in places where climate refugees will live, because the social and economic disaster and cost of maintaining communities that are unhappy will become so burdensome to society that we'll need to invest in new infrastructure. And I have big belief in the fact that, in working with refugees myself, that actually many of the most distressed communities will become the incubators of the future of the city. Not to say this as guinea pigs, but rather that they will be recipients of innovations that maybe other places won't. Just like in Africa, we went from 0G to 4G in a decade. So I'll stop here and say that I think I would like to invite you all to dream about the future of the city and think that it can really contribute to our relationship to the planet, to ecological harmony, as Dror says it, and to managing a much more healthy distribution of how we actually operate on this planet. I want to go now into a second part, which is around obstacles. What do we see as obstacles to our dreams? I'm going to let Dror start. I think that what we see right now is that these things that you've looked at, why are they not in your neighborhood? Well, let's think about that for a minute. Dror, do you want to talk about obstacles for a minute?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of different obstacles. I'm just going to name a couple that I think are the major ones that I see. Number one, it's ego. And I think it's not just about design, right? Like, there's just a lot of egos in the ways often that are preventing from the ideas that can really yield unique results to surface. I think I'm bundling with ego also the lack of desire to change things, right? Like, no, it's good like that. We've been doing it like this. It's working. Okay, we don't need to change. I think the second thing that I find often, which I think is, I put it above climate change as a problem and biodiversity, is a lack of imagination. I think that we live, unfortunately, in a society where we don't dare to imagine. We are so used to being fed that we numb our dreaming. You know, I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. And it's incredible how you hear the word, I'm bored, after 1 minute of having no particular interaction. I'm like, you just did that a minute ago and now you're bored. You know, I think that we've lost the beauty of spending time contemplating. Being bored is not necessarily a bad thing for a kid that age to just use their imagination and not constantly be fed with stimulation. So I really think as society, we have to imagine more, we have to dream more. We immediately rush into research and development. And I think that if we pause for a second, jumping into research and really like taking the time to have, you know, a carte blanche scenario where no limitation, no boundaries, there's some amazing things that can be born from that.
I couldn't agree with you more. Effectively, the ability to dream collectively is being thwarted by a lack of patience, a lack of curiosity sometimes, and probably also, you know, egotistical, narcissistic behaviors that are being rewarded in our economic system. You know, I'm not going to point names at any particular presidents, but you see what I'm getting at. So, Alexander, what are to you some of the obstacles towards this dream, you know, other than, let's say, the state of mind and the way that we see, you know, why are we not seeing more of what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, so I really appreciate with both you and Dror, Dror and Thomas, that you want to experiment, that you want to, and the scale doesn't have to be always huge, but you want to change the way things are being done. So you want to know my analysis of why it's so difficult, is that the more we go into crisis mode, the more we think we have to fall back on what works. You know, we know what works, we just have to do it again and again, except that doing what so-called works and doing that again, it brought us to this place. So the difficulty that all of us face is this deeply entrenched aversion to risk-taking, and there is a sort of a conflagration, a weird partnership between bureaucratic thinking, administrative thinking, and, let's say, civil engineering thinking. And I can say this because I have a civil engineering degree. So there is a problematic joining of the minds in which you always don't want to take risk because things could go wrong. So you stick with what you know so-called works, except that what you know works brought us to where we are, so it doesn't actually. And so there is an extremely conservative reflex in the way we think about our big projects. That fight, and that's a fight. I mean, we don't want to fight, we want to all get along, but in the end, there is a sort of an old idea there that stands in the way. And for me, that sort of unholy alliance of bureaucracy and civil engineering thinking, and you know, there's many amazing engineers, and they are the people that will bring us closer to a solution, but there is a lot of standard thinking, standard off-the-shelf thinking that is unholy. That partnership, that's the enemy to our salvation.
Yeah, I don't want to summarize that, but I'm going to try and say that there's a mismatch between the accounting mindset in society and the dreaming mindset that's required to take the level of risk that you know, the leaps and bounds of our imagination should challenge the status quo with. So I'm going to just suggest that before we move on to the next question, you know, we just name a couple hurdles that are practical. So, for example, I'm going to mention one which, you know, I've been a fervent opponent to the existing planning structures. I mentioned master planning as being a discipline which is a bit rotten because it's often pushing towards corruption. It scales things. You need to make big deals with people, politicians, etc. And it's basically those with the most money who win, because they can pay the legal fees, they can bribe the right people or influence people through media and such. So we end up having cities that are driven by top-down approval mechanisms, and planning is just the end of that. And so planning in itself is a discipline which is problematic because, you know, I'll give you just a small example. It took me 7 years. I designed a house near Los Angeles. It took me 7 years to get planning for a house for my family. And, you know, as an architect who's practiced pretty much anywhere in the world, I'm like, that's pretty impressive that I would find so much opposition to what I'm doing, which is an ecologically sound house, very small footprint, doesn't hurt anyone, and I know the criteria for design, and I'm adding value to my neighbors. And so this is just a small example to say, well, imagine the stress test for trying to do new stuff when the right things get that level of opposition, when they're that minute in scale. So planning is a real obstacle, and I think everyone who's in this room who wants to pursue a career in making the future of cities possible should bear in mind that they need to find every possible hack to aggressively downscale the negative spiral of planning in their work. So that's just my view. I don't know if you agree, but I'm going to let you maybe mention one clear obstacle you've met in your career. Planning for me has been the biggest obstacle to every good project I've seen because it politicizes and diminishes the ambition.
Yeah, I like very much what you said about master planning is dead or should be dead. I think that, you know, the biggest problem with master planning is the master and the title and the authority, right? So if we see ourselves as the master of Earth, that is the mistake. And this is one of the reasons we chose to use the term bioplanning, because we actually want to ask, what would nature do? How would nature design? We are not the masters. We forget often that there is 4.5 billion years of evolution to how nature designed things. We only have, you know, a minute. So really understanding that is extremely important. The second thing I think is important is the fact that we often forget that we are designing for experiences, right? If we are designing a wedding, we know that we're designing for the experience of the wedding. It's very clear. I want to make a great party. I know what I need for that great party. I want to make people emotional. I know what are the things that I need to make. I want to create a connection. I want to spark love. I know what to do. Why aren't we doing that with urban planning? Why are we, you know, perfecting for utilitarian precision and for, you know, value engineering as our priorities, right? Value engineering should be a creative pursuit, not a chart, not not only an economic pursuit, right? Somebody needs to understand, well, if we cut this, what experiences are we cutting? And what can we offset should really be more of a creative pursuit. So I think that if we start to put the attention about making cities and places and communities about human connection, about building trust, about building equality, about building friendships, rather than what we call smart cities, right? I rather live in a romantic, you know, loving place than a smart place.
Oh,
Thank you.
exactly. I often say smart cities are very dumb. So I couldn't agree with you more. Do you want to maybe add a practical obstacle to, where we are?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd like to add something which has to do with the supposed smartness of technology in relation to our cities. So what we see today is that many times an investor wants to do something, whether it's a bunch of windmills or a tower or you name it, some kind of project. Any project that is proposed will generate opposition. This is logical, it is to be expected. This is often a game without a positive outcome, or too many times it ends up like that. It just is a standoff between an investor and an environment of the investment, people living around it, the mayor, others that don't like it, don't want it, are against it, and the whole thing gets blocked. It gets blocked forever. So we have often not such a smart idea to begin with by the investor, who looks just at their bottom line, at the financial revenue sheet, and from there nothing happens. So we built a set of algorithms, and we built software with a company called solve.world. And I want to really bring it up here because we're now at a point where if anybody wants to do a project somewhere, we can in fact predict what the reactions will be of the environment, of the people around the proposed project. And with that prediction, we can also have a great sense of what the values are of these people around the project. And with the values of the people and with their opposition, we can actually predict what would be a much better outcome, a much greater outcome, and a smarter project definition that would not be against what the investor wants, but it would also be in favor of what the people around the investment need. So that simple synthesis of finding a project that can get a yes, it can get a yes from almost anybody, of course from the investor, but most importantly from all these other people, to be able to predict that, then I think is smart. And that's what we try to, or not we're trying to, we have evidence, we know how it works, we have an engine that can predict that for new investments. And so what I think this is helpful for is it will help protect a lot of bad investments from ever happening. We are marshalling the wisdom of the crowd to get to much better starting points so that the designer, an actual designer, can get to work and has something interesting to work with and not just have a one-liner that fits a specific accounting bottom line or financial bottom line. So just to repeat, we can today predict what you will say if you live around the project. We can predict how it needs to be completely rethought, the project, to fit with your values and your needs. And what we learn is that your values and your needs, if you can formulate them positively, will make it a much better project. And if you have a much better project, we really have marshaled your wisdom. So what we think of as NIMBY, not in my backyard, I'm against the project, all this, actually has a very positive underlying potential. And we can bring that out. And that's how we can generate collective intelligence and generate much better project definitions that then you have some tools to speak with your client or your investor client with to get to a better project.
This is very important, and
I have to jump in
yeah.
because I have a bit of a problem with some prediction.
Can I interrupt you just one sec?
Sure.
Just because I want to bring us to our last part, and this actually I think will segue with what you're saying. I'll give you the mic in a sec. I also have a resistance to predictive analytics. I basically founded the first nonprofit for urban participation projects and collaborative design, which is founded on similar principles of collective intelligence. But basically the main harvesting tool of support and buy-in is asking people and involving them in an analog way before it's digitized. So I think I don't disagree with you at all that knowing what people want is the most important thing in a project today. And I don't disagree with that we can leverage technology. What I just want to do is to frame this in a way where we can work together on it. You know, in my view, there's a kind of call to action in a place like this. You know, at Love Tomorrow, it's a younger community. You know, we're like the guys with the gray hair that are boring. So, you know, we'll party tomorrow, so you'll see us dancing. Don't worry. So, effectively, you know, what can we transmit? What can we transfer? You know, I think it's the appetite for contribution in where you live, and the notion that you have an important say through 3 particular devices, and I'll pass the mic after. The first one is that knowingly or unknowingly, data is harvested about you that will feed into a series of devices, systems, processes that public, private partners or not, but players will leverage for or against you. What I mean is that they're going to take information about you predictively and assume what you need or want. So that's happening. And there's good and bad sides to that. The second one is that there is a whole set of new opportunities that exist for you to participate. I'm part of 2 different apps that allow you to contribute to your local projects. And they're going to be as easy as Facebook. And when you add to that, you know, AR, VR, or XR, any form of interaction devices that can leverage this intelligently, you know, I'm not pro VR all the time. I'm just saying it can be used intelligently, and particularly in low-income communities where you give these tools. So basically, we'll give the tools of designers to you. You know, if you're a designer, of course you'll do that, but if you're not, the tools will come out to you. And the last thing, which I think is, you know, binds these, is that we will know very well, very soon, through artificial intelligence, which I'll speak about later tonight, basically all the different things that different places need for them to have their ecological integrity and participate in the regenerative systemics of, you know, the world's machinery. And we can do that with full biomimicry understanding through computational intelligence. So we're going to be able to effectively know much better what each place should be for the interest of everyone. And then we'll know whether or not it makes sense that we build something or not in that place. So I'll stop here and say, you know, I want to invite you to think that you are not passive receivers of the city. You are going to be part of it, whether you like it or not, and I encourage you to want it. Thank you.
Great. So what's the question?
Thank you. Sorry.
So what's the question?
Well, the question is, you were going to say something about,
Yeah.
you know, which I think the question is, how do you bring this to a call to action? How do you get people involved in the most meaningful way now, in this room and beyond?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for framing it, Thomas. I just want to touch first on the prediction point. 200 years ago, we predicted that New York City cannot grow any longer because there is simply no more room for the manure of the horses, right? And there are certain things we simply cannot predict, especially when we're thinking about urban planning decisions and laying infrastructure for generations to come. There are certain human behaviors that we can't predict simply because we can't predict how we're going to live in 100 years from now. We hope that we're going to still love coming together and, you know, having a face-to-face interaction, and we can still hope that we have a relationship with nature, but there's certain things we cannot predict, and I think that the areas that we feel that we cannot predict, we have to design for a certain flexibility that allows for a certain room for that change to happen. So I think that in terms of participation, I'm amazed, and we're all amazed with AI capabilities, right? We are concerned about it, but we're also fascinated by it. And I'm not going to get into the controversy aspect of it. I'm just going to say that those tools allows more and more people to participate as curators of content, as makers of content, whether it's written words or imagery or videos. And I think that we are all citizens of the world. We all can imagine what cities can be, what environments can be, and we don't necessarily need to have a degree behind us to make a suggestion, a proposal, a prediction, a desire. And I think that if collectively we will have more people participating in sharing their visions, the richer our culture and our environment can be.
Thank you. Alexander, you're going to have the last statement to close us off. How do we bring this room closer to the future we want?
Well, I really like your call to action, and I just want to second it. I think it's really critical for all of us to if you have the energy and the time in your life to help think us through this. One short note on prediction and forecasting. I think we can all realize that a lot of what we do is based on forecasts. We forecast sea level rise. We are forecasting temperature change. We can also do intelligent forecasting for how good projects ought to take shape. That's not to predict how the design should happen. It is to give intelligence to the designer to do it. But so the forecasting is not an art. Forecasting is a deeply scientific venture. And all the science that we have about forecasting tells us that crowd forecasting delivers better matches with what happens later than individual forecasting. So well-curated crowds are better for your forecast. That's why we need you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention. And we wish you a beautiful afternoon and day. Thank you. Thank you, Dror. Thank you, Alexander. I'm Thomas Ermacora. See you maybe next year.